We are go for liftoff in T-minus 30.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've got some research you sent us that we're going to dive into, and it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's about a study on what the researchers call atypical sexual fantasies, desires, and behaviors among gay men in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Back in 2008. So this is a little bit of a time travel deep dive that we're doing.
I love it.
But I think it's going to make us all rethink what's considered unusual even today. So are you ready to get into it?
Absolutely. You know, this study really is a gem. It offers a glimpse into a community that's often misrepresented and misunderstood. So I think there's a lot to uncover here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to get into this with you. So let's first kind of set the scene right. It's 2008. We're in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Culturally, religiously, things were a bit different than they are today.
Right. Yeah. Back then, Puerto Rico was predominantly Catholic with a mix of other faiths, of course. But society generally emphasized more traditional relationships and practices when it came to sexuality.
Yeah. So with that backdrop in mind, this study involved 429 gay men.
What?
From all over the island. They answered questionnaires about their experiences.
Okay.
Now, really important to remember, these men weren't randomly selected.
Right.
They were recruited from gay social venues and events.
Okay.
So we can't necessarily say these findings apply to all gay men in Puerto Rico.
Gotcha. Right. Like a very specific subset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to it. What kind of atypical desires were they looking at?
All right. Well, hold on to your hats because the most common one might surprise you.
Okay.
Over 93%
Oh,
of these men reported being aroused by erotic pictures or films.
that's a lot.
Right.
It makes me wonder if what's labeled atypical is more about societal norms than what people actually experience privately.
Yeah, you're onto something there. It definitely challenges some assumptions, doesn't it?
Big time. Okay, what else did they find?
Here's where it gets juicy. Almost 80% of men fantasized about a partner at least 10 years older than them.
Whoa. Talk about turning those typical age match ideas on their head. It makes you think maybe age in fantasies isn't such a rigid factor as we believe.
For sure.
Okay, what about specifics? Did this study get into particular desires?
They did. About 75% of the men reported something called partialism.
Partialism. I'm not familiar.
So partialism means being attracted to specific body parts.
Okay.
Think foot fetishes, for example.
Okay.
We don't know exactly which body parts were involved in this study.
Right.
But the fact that 3/4 of the men reported this tells us there's a whole lot of variety in these atypical desires.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got erotic images, older partners, specific body parts. It's all making me realize how much we categorize desires without really understanding how common they are.
Mm-hmm.
So did they ask about voyeurism?
They did.
Okay.
About half of the participants reported being aroused by secretly watching someone undress or have sex.
Oh.
Now, this is where things get a little fuzzy, isn't
Yeah,
it?
right,
Like, where do we draw the line between a common fantasy and something that could be harmful?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, voyeurism often gets a bad rap, but this study suggests it might be a pretty common experience for a lot of men.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you think, what else are we labeling as deviant that might actually be quite normal?
Exactly. It challenges us to re-examine our assumptions, doesn't it?
Okay, now here's where I think things get really interesting. The study found that only a tiny fraction of the men, less than 1%,
Wow.
reported feeling bad about their fantasies or behaviors. Over 90% said they had good or stable mental health and self-esteem.
Interesting.
That's kind of surprising, right?
It is. What's fascinating here is this disconnect between how widespread these desires seem to be and how little distress they caused.
Yeah.
It flips the script on the idea that atypical automatically means someone is struggling.
Right, totally. And remember, this is 2008.
Right.
It makes you wonder how those perceptions might have shifted over the past 17 years.
Yeah.
You know, with all the progress we've seen in terms of LGBTQ plus visibility and acceptance, it also makes you think about how many people might still be silently struggling with shame or guilt
Right.
about their desires simply because they don't fit neatly into what's considered the norm.
Absolutely. And that's where I think the need for more open and honest conversations comes in.
Yes.
You know, about the full spectrum of human sexuality without judgment or preconceived notions.
I love that. Okay, so if they're not distressed, does that mean they're seeking help for these desires?
Well, not necessarily. It turns out only 15% of the men had sought help related to these less common desires.
I'm going to guess that shame and fear of judgment are still huge factors,
Huge.
even within the gay community.
Absolutely. The study found that those were the top reasons for not seeking help.
Yeah.
It really speaks volumes about the stigma that still surrounds these topics, even in a community that already faces so much discrimination.
It's a shame because it sounds like there's a real need for open, non-judgmental spaces
Yeah.
to talk about these experiences.
Yes.
So who did these men turn to when they did seek support?
Interestingly, their gay friends were the most common source of support, followed by psychologists.
Okay.
Traditional figures like priests or family members were much less likely to be approached.
That makes sense, right? Trust and understanding within the gay community are probably paramount when dealing with such personal stuff.
Absolutely.
So did the study ask about who they would prefer to turn to, even if they hadn't actually done so?
They did, and there was a slight shift while gay friends were the go-to in reality.
Yeah.
A lot of the men said they'd prefer to talk to a psychologist if they could.
Oh, interesting. So even though they rely on their friends, there's a desire for professional guidance too.
That's what it seems to suggest. It raises some interesting questions about how accessible and safe mental health services are perceived to be for this population.
That's a great point. So we're seeing a lot of variation in experiences here, from the desires themselves to how they're perceived and who people feel comfortable talking to about them. Are there any other factors that the study connected to these atypical desires?
There are a couple interesting correlations they found. For instance, men with higher levels of education were more likely to view less common desires as normal.
It's pretty hopeful, actually.
Yeah.
Education can be such a powerful tool for breaking down stigma and fostering understanding.
Right.
What about religion? Did the researchers look into that at all?
They did, and the results might surprise you.
Right.
Religious practice didn't seem to have a negative impact on these men's self-esteem.
Interesting.
Most of them reported feeling good about themselves regardless of their religious beliefs.
Wow. So even within a context where some sexual practices might be considered taboo or sinful, these men were still able to maintain a positive self-image.
That seems to be the case. Yeah.
That's amazing. It also suggests that there's more nuance to the relationship between religion and self-acceptance within the gay community than we might assume.
I think so. It challenges some of the common narratives we hear about those two things always being at odds with each other.
For sure. Now, on a more serious note, the study did touch on the topic of suicide.
Yes, a small percentage of the men, although any is too many,
Right.
reported having suicidal thoughts or attempts that they connected to these less common desires.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. And
Yeah.
it really underscores the emotional complexities and potential vulnerabilities tied to these topics and why accessible affirming support systems are so crucial.
I completely agree. This is not something to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
Open dialogue and access to quality mental health care are absolutely essential.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already,
We have.
and there's still so much to unpack.
Yeah.
But before we dive deeper, let's take a quick break to process all this amazing information. We'll be right back with more insights from this fascinating study on atypical desires among gay men in Puerto Rico.
Sounds good.
Okay, we're back. And man, I'm still thinking about all the layers to this study. You know, it's really shifting my perspective on what's considered normal when it comes to desire.
Yeah, it is really eye-opening, isn't it? You know, one thing that keeps coming up for me is this whole idea that atypical doesn't necessarily equal unhealthy. Like, remember we were talking about the surprisingly high self-esteem reported by the men in this study?
Right.
I'm curious, did the researchers look into any connections between these less common desires and mental health challenges? Like, aside from the few who reported suicidal thoughts, of course.
That's a great question because, yeah, you could easily assume there's a link there.
Right.
But this study seems to be telling a different story.
Yeah, and I think this is where that whole idea of individual experience becomes really important.
Yeah.
Remember, only a tiny fraction of the men, less than 1%, reported feeling bad during those fantasies or behaviors.
Right.
And the vast majority said they felt good, satisfied, even fascinated.
So for most of them, these desires weren't really a source of internal conflict or distress.
No, that's what the data suggests, which really challenges the assumption that anyone engaging in less common sexual practices must be struggling with some deep-seated mental health issue, you know?
Yeah.
That's just not that simple.
No, it's not. And remember, this study was done back in 2008.
Right.
So it makes you wonder how those perceptions might have shifted over the past 17 years.
Yeah.
You know, with all the progress we've seen in terms of LGBTQ plus visibility and acceptance.
Totally. And it also makes you think about how many people might still be silently struggling with shame or guilt about their desires simply because they don't fit neatly into what's considered the norm.
It highlights the need for more open and honest conversations, doesn't it? About the full spectrum of human sexuality without judgment or preconceived notions.
Couldn't agree more. We need to create spaces where people feel safe to explore and understand their desires, whatever those might be.
Well said. Speaking of understanding, we talked earlier about how men with higher education levels were more likely to view less common desires as normal.
Right.
So it seems like education could play a big role in breaking down stigma and promoting acceptance.
Oh, absolutely. Knowledge is definitely power, especially when it comes to challenging outdated beliefs and broadening our perspectives. The more we learn about the diversity of human experience, the less likely we are to label something as wrong just because it's different.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the social dynamics at play here.
Hmm.
This study was conducted in Puerto Rico, where Catholicism has historically held a strong influence.
Right.
How did the researchers address that?
Oh, that's a great point. That cultural and religious context adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The researchers were definitely curious about how religious beliefs might be influencing these men's experiences with less common desires.
Yeah, it would be easy to assume that religion would lead to more internal conflict around sexuality.
Yeah.
Especially in a more traditionally religious context like Puerto Rico.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But the results were actually pretty surprising.
Right.
They found that religious practice didn't seem to have a negative impact on self-esteem. Most of the men, regardless of their religious beliefs, reported feeling good about themselves.
So even within a system of beliefs, where some sexual practices might be considered taboo or sinful,
Yeah.
these men were still able to maintain a positive sense of self.
Yeah, that's what the data indicates. It really speaks to their resilience and ability to find a way to integrate their personal beliefs with their sexual identities. Like, it's not about denying one or the other,
Right.
but finding a way to make them coexist.
It's a powerful message. It also speaks to the fact that religious beliefs themselves are constantly evolving. We're seeing a lot of faith communities becoming more inclusive and affirming of diverse sexualities, which is really encouraging.
Oh, it's definitely a sign of progress, even though there's still a long way to go in terms of overcoming prejudice and discrimination.
Absolutely. Okay, let's zoom in on the social aspect a bit more. We touched on the importance of gay friends as a source of support. Did the study offer any insights into the dynamics of those friendships? What made them supportive environments for these men?
Unfortunately, the study didn't really get into the specifics of those relationships. Like, we don't know exactly what made those connections so supportive.
I mean, even without those details, I think it's safe to say that shared experiences, empathy, and a lack of judgment likely played a role in creating safe spaces for these men to open up about such personal stuff.
Oh, I think you're right. It highlights how important those kinds of connections are, especially when dealing with something as sensitive as sexuality. It makes you wonder, though, what happens to gay men who might be geographically isolated or lack access to strong LGBTQ plus communities.
Yeah.
Like, where do they turn for support?
That's a really important point. It highlights the need for accessible and affirming resources, both online and offline, for individuals who might not have those in-person support networks.
Definitely, we need to make sure everyone has access to the information and support they need to navigate their sexuality in a healthy and positive way.
Speaking of resources, did the study look into formal support systems like therapy or counseling?
They did, and this is where we see that disconnect between desire and action.
Yeah.
While a lot of the men said they'd prefer to talk to a psychologist if they could,
Right.
only a small percentage had actually sought professional help related to their less common desires.
Why do you think that is? I mean, therapy can be so beneficial for exploring any kind of issue, especially something as personal as sexuality.
It's hard to say for sure, but there are probably multiple factors at play. We've already talked about the stigma surrounding these topics, both within society at large and within the gay community itself.
Right, the fear of judgment, discrimination, or even legal repercussions could be preventing some men from reaching out.
Exactly. And then there's that whole issue of internalized homophobia.
Yeah.
Even within LGBTQ plus spaces, there can be pressures to conform to certain norms and expectations.
Right.
Which might make it hard for individuals with less common desires to feel comfortable sharing their experiences openly.
So it's not just about societal stigma, but also about the complexities of acceptance and understanding within the gay community itself. It seems like there's a need for more nuanced conversations about sexual diversity, even within spaces that are already marginalized.
I couldn't agree more. Breaking down stigma requires ongoing dialogue and education, no matter what community we're talking about.
Right.
We need to challenge those assumptions and create a culture where people feel safe to be themselves fully and authentically.
Well said. This study really drives home the point that There's no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding human sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Every individual's experience is unique and valid, and it's crucial to approach these conversations with open minds and compassionate hearts.
I completely agree. It's about embracing that vast spectrum of human desire and recognizing that what's considered atypical might actually be far more common than we realize.
This has been such an insightful conversation, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts. We'll be right back with some final takeaways and reflections on this groundbreaking research. All right, we're back. And I gotta say, this deep dive has really challenged some of my own assumptions about sexuality,
Yeah.
I feel like we've uncovered so many layers here. It's really fascinating.
It really has been quite the journey, and it's amazing how much we can learn from a single study like this, especially one that tackles such a, often misunderstood topic like atypical sexual desires.
Yeah, and what really stands out to me is this disconnect between what we might label as atypical and actual levels of distress or dysfunction.
Right.
So many of these men were engaging in these less common sexual practices, but they weren't necessarily struggling with their mental health or feeling bad about themselves.
Yeah, it throws a wrench in that whole, idea that anything outside the quote-unquote norm must automatically be a problem.
Yeah.
This study really, I think, points to a need for a more individualized approach to understanding sexuality. Moving away from these rigid categories and labels.
It makes you wonder if what's considered taboo is more about societal expectations than inherent harm.
Right.
And what might have been viewed as deviant back in 2008 might be seen very differently today,
For sure.
given how much, cultural attitudes have shifted.
Absolutely. Social norms and values are constantly evolving, and, our understanding of sexuality evolves right alongside them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good reminder to, stay open to new information and perspectives and to challenge those ingrained beliefs that we have that might not hold true anymore.
I'm also struck by the resilience and self-acceptance of these men.
Yeah.
Despite potential stigma and judgment,
Yeah.
they were largely able to embrace their desires and maintain a positive sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
That's a powerful message, don't you think?
Incredibly powerful. It speaks to the human capacity for growth and self-love, even in the face of adversity, And it reminds us that we all have the power to define our own version of what it means to live a fulfilling and authentic life, regardless of what, societal pressures or expectations might be.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a minute and think about, the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
What are some lessons we can take from this study that apply beyond just, gay men in Puerto Rico?
Right.
What does this tell us about human sexuality as a whole?
I think there are several takeaways that resonate with all of us, no matter, our sexual orientation or background.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I think the study underscores the importance of challenging our own biases and assumptions when it comes to sexuality,
Yeah.
We often make judgments based on limited information or outdated beliefs, which can lead to, misunderstandings and even harm.
Yeah, it's a reminder to approach each individual with empathy and a willingness to listen,
Yes.
rather than imposing our own preconceived notions or expectations.
Exactly. Be curious, not judgmental, right? Secondly, I think this study emphasizes the need for open and honest communication about sexuality.
Yeah.
Too often these topics are shrouded in secrecy or shame, which prevents individuals from seeking support or understanding.
Right.
So we need to create safe spaces for these conversations, both within families and in our communities.
And lastly, this research really highlights the power of self-acceptance.
Yes.
I know it might sound cliche, but embracing who you are, even the parts that society might deem atypical or different,
Right.
it's essential for well-being.
I couldn't agree more, I think this research is really a call to action.
Yes.
To challenge stigma, to promote understanding, and to empower individuals to embrace their unique sexualities without fear or shame, It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and accepted for who they truly are.
Well said. It's been such a privilege to dive into this topic with you, and to our listener, we hope this episode has given you some food for thought. Maybe it sparked some questions, or even challenged some of your own assumptions. And we encourage you to keep exploring these complex issues with an open mind and a compassionate heart.
Absolutely.
That's what the deep dive is all about.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep diving deep.